Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar. We're just going to give it a minute or two for everyone to dial in, and then we'll get kicking off.
We're running this over the telephone system today, are we?
Sorry, over the telephone
Invited
system?
Everyone to dial in.
Oh, yes. No, I personally
Very old-fashioned.
Happy days.
Yeah, I've personally dialed in using my dial-up connection at home. That's where I'm jumping in from today.
That's faster than your NBN, isn't it?
Cool. All right, we might kick it off. Good afternoon, everyone, or should I say hello, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. My name's Chris, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting today's webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining and participating in the webinar today. So thank you very much to everyone for joining for our latest webinar. Today's topic, for those of you that can see on the screen, is the value of measuring your accessibility maturity. And presenting the webinar today are two of the people leading the work, particularly in our strategy area at Intopia. We've got Andrew Arch, who's our principal consultant, and Neil Jarvis, one of our senior digital accessibility consultants. If you have any questions about anything that Andrew and Neil are presenting on today, please do put them in the Q&A feature that's available on the screen. You can put in those questions now or any time throughout the presentation. We should hopefully have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. So please do put all your questions through there. We would also like to acknowledge that today's captioning is being provided by AI Media. And if for any reason you need to jump out during the middle of the webinar, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel shortly after the event. And now that we've done all the housekeeping, Neil, I might throw it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Crispy. Thanks very much indeed. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Today, we are going to cover the following topics: what digital accessibility maturity actually is, and why we might want to measure it. How do we go about measuring it? Once we've established the why, we'll establish the how. And to do that, we will take a look at one particular model of maturity assessment that we draw from, but also there are others. And so we'll talk a little bit about the fact that there are a number of models that you can get familiar with, and talk a little bit about how they all work and the differences between them. We'll then discuss aspects of gap analysis. And the reason we'll do that is because whilst we're not discussing gap analysis here per se, a maturity assessment does take into account gap analysis techniques, and many of them are used in both a gap analysis and a maturity assessment. So we'll talk a little bit about the sort of assessments that we'll do where we do a gap analysis as well. And that would include recommendations and also next steps for anyone that we were working with.
So let's define what we're actually going to be talking about. What is digital accessibility maturity, and why would we want to measure it? Basically, it's a measure of how well an organisation is doing with respect to all their digital products and services. It can go beyond that, but if we're restricted to digital accessibility maturity, it's what you're doing internally, it's what you're doing externally for customers, it's the emails that you might be sending out as marketing collateral. It might be other digital things that you might have a kiosk, for instance, in a storefront. There's various models, as Neil said, that we can use to measure digital accessibility, but a lot of them talk about a range of stages. And I've got a diagram on screen which I've actually drawn from Icon in the UK, because I just like the way that they put that together to say that there's an initial stage where the processes are unpredictable. You just got pockets of people maybe trying to do stuff. I've got no consistency. It's your whole reaction to digital accessibility is reactive rather than controlled and defined. You get to that repeated stage where processes might be defined and are documented, what they call the defined stage. And these stages are common across a whole lot of maturity models, not just digital accessibility. The defined stage is where the processes are pretty much standardized across your organization or within the the area of your organization that you're looking at. You get to the managed stage where the processes are monitored and controlled, and then you get to that what at the peak there is optimized, where the processes are standardized, they're monitored and controlled, but they're being continuously improved. And you're doing a horizon scan. You're looking at what it is that you're trying to achieve. You're getting feedback from staff, from customers, and so on. So at that point, you're controlling the whole process.
So what is the value and why do we do it? Why are we going to measure maturity on digital accessibility? What's the point? Well, we do it because we want to get the measurement of current effectiveness of groups or organizations' accessibility practices. So lots of organizations want to work in accessibility. They think they're doing very well. Some of them are doing very well. Some of them probably less so. And by measuring, we can actually get an objective view as to how well they're actually doing, and then help them to build a roadmap to the next phase for them. So we will help them to assess the gaps between the current capabilities that they have and the next level of accessibility maturity. Knowing where they are on a given scale and what the gaps in culture, knowledge, process, etc. are, and how we can encourage them and enable them to improve their overall accessibility performance over time. So again, that's looking at helping them move from where they are now to where they want to be. Then, of course, there's the issue of helping them to mitigate risk. They'll do that for legal, reputational, and financial reasons. The risks do exist if you're not accessible. And whilst we're not going to be focusing on that today, it's really important to know that you can mitigate that risk by raising your maturity. A couple of organizations as well that we have worked with in the last few months even have told us that they hope that by raising their maturity level of digital accessibility, it almost gives them permission to add accessibility to their business as usual practices. And that's something which is really important to them.
So how might we measure our maturity? As Neil and I both said, there are many good models out there which can be used to measure your digital accessibility and your level of maturity. There's a lot of commonality across all of them, but many of them do have their pros and cons. And when we're working with an organisation, we're trying to pull bits and pieces together from a range of different models that we know are going to suit the organisation or the brief that we've been given to look at. Because sometimes you're looking at a whole organisation, sometimes you're just looking at how a team in an organisation operates. And we did that late last year for an organisation. So the purposes of demonstrating the value, we're going to take a look at the draft model currently being designed by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. And that model is composed of a variety of dimensions and then the maturity stages. And each dimension has associated proof points and deliverables by which that process can be measured. And you can set goals and outcomes for each stage, which are relevant to the dimension being measured. And you mightn't measure all of those dimensions because some of them might not be applicable, particularly if you're not looking at the organisation as a whole. You're just looking at how a team is doing. Some of them mightn't be applicable. So let's look at those dimensions and then pick a couple of dimensions and take a closer look at the examples of goals, outcomes, and how you're going to prove what level you are within that dimension.
So as Andrea says, we are picking up the model that is currently being drafted by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And this is still a model that's in draft stage. It's been evolving as over the past couple of years or so. But it's a really good example of a model that works well. And it's a tool that will help you to assess the current effectiveness and capabilities of an entire organization, or just parts of an organization. So it might just be specific teams within that organization, maybe a particular department that's got a particular desire to raise its game. It will also help to identify gaps between current capabilities and the next level of accessibility and maturity. We mentioned that before. That's common to any model. It'll help you to plan for improvements to your organization's accessibility performance over time. So that's why the model is really valuable. And so, yeah, the dimensions are really interesting because they go across the whole work of an organization or a team within an organization. So the dimensions that model particularly has, there are 7 of them. And those are firstly communications. Information as it relates to an organization's accessibility, as well as the accessibility of all internal and external communication. So it's not just the fact that they want to make their internal and external comms accessible. That's obviously a key part of it, but it's also the way you tell people about the accessibility of those communications. The second dimension is knowledge and skills. Ongoing education and training and outsourcing practices to fill gaps for accessibility operations. So that's very much your training and skills acquisition part of the work that you do, your learning. The third dimension is support, the accessibility of assistance that is provided to internal employees or to external customers who have disability. The fourth dimension is ICT development lifecycle. And that's where the incorporation of web, software, and hardware accessibility considerations in development processes. And that would be from the idea and the conception of a product, say, for example, through design, development, testing, whether an ACR, an accessibility conformance report, is produced at the end of the process, whether there's been any user research, maintenance, and obsolescence, all the way through to that final process, that final part of the life cycle. And the fifth dimension is personnel, job descriptions, recruitment practices, disability-related employee resource and groups that are there to support people, as well as means and methods to get the input of people with lived experience of disability. The sixth dimension, the penultimate one, is procurement. That's the strategic process that concentrates on finding and acquiring accessible products that are required by an organization. Activities in this dimension would include sourcing of products, negotiation with vendors, and selecting goods and services. And the final dimension is culture. The attitudes and sensitivity and the behaviors around accessibility, including internal interaction, perception, and decision-making. Each dimension can have goals and outcomes assigned and associated at each stage of the process. And later on, we'll talk more about the particular maturity stages that the model has. Strictly speaking, though, the first of those stages is the inactive stage, as you'll find out. And at the inactive stage, there probably aren't going to be any goals or outputs because it's inactive.
So how do we measure these different stages, each dimension? To assess the maturity stage for each dimension, the W3C have proposed a series of proof points that can be used as evidence. Evidence-based organisational deliverables used to measure the maturity. They're specific to the dimension being focused on. For example, if only procurement maturity is being measured, and Neil and I just ran a series of seminars for the higher education sector about accessible maturity, accessible procurement, then only the procurement proof points would be evaluated, and you wouldn't worry too much about the others. Though you might think about personnel, because have you got the right personnel in your procurement team? They're likely to span several stages. They can be partially completed at the start, at the launch and the integrate stages, but they must be fully completed before you get to that optimized stage, that peak of that pyramid that we had on the screen a few minutes ago. And then the proof points demonstrate the completed outcomes and should be relevant to the dimension that you're measuring and to the organisation or the team that's being measured. So if an outcome is not relevant, you can mark it as not applicable, makes it easy. So it'd be pointless requiring an organisation to meet outcomes related to native apps if they've only got a website and shop fronts and a call centre. So you need to make sure that you're picking the right dimensions and the right proof points to measure those.
So let's have a look at the different stages of maturity that this model presents. And as Andrew said, it's something which will be quite familiar in some ways, following the diagram from ICON that Andrew showed earlier on in the presentation. But this has slightly different ones, but you'll be able to see that they're very much related. Using the evidence or the proof points that Andrew has just talked about, you can measure an organization's progress on each dimension, which then leads to a determination of the maturity level of the organization or the department within it that's being assessed. So the 4 stages of maturity are inactive. At that stage, there's no awareness and recognition of need. In other words, it's just not on anyone's radar. And there are a lot.
And at this point, you're probably not even thinking about your digital accessibility maturity, but it is common that, a couple of those dimensions might be still inactive, even though you moved on to as Neil will describe, some of the other stages with some of your activities against some dimensions.
Yeah. So it's a stage that most organizations will have been at some point, hopefully a decreasing number, but actually we still see quite a few around. The next stage, level 2, if you like, is the launch stage. And at this point, there is a recognized need. So people have woken up to the need for digital accessibility within their organization. Planning has been initiated, or is being initiated at least. But activities are not well organized and not well coordinated. They're quite ad hoc, but there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of individual passion going on for getting accessibility onto the agenda of the organization. The third stage is the integrate stage, and this is where things really start to ramp up. Roadmap is in place. Overall organizational approach is defined, and it is well organized. And that is really a significant departure from where many organizations are. You're starting to see systematic accessibility being applied within an organization. And the fourth and the highest stage in this particular model is also called optimized, and it's accessibility is incorporated into the whole organization, consistently evaluated. Actions are taken on assessment outcomes. So you really are beginning to see that accessibility is just part of the BAU of an organization. So those are the 4 stages, and the World Wide Web Consortium assists people who want to use this model. It has produced quite a handy little spreadsheet, which actually it's not that little, it's in several worksheets. Each worksheet corresponding to each of the dimensions that we talked about earlier, the 7 dimensions. And with those worksheets, you can score the proof points that Andrew talked about earlier, the evidential proof points. You can score them, and using those scores against each dimension, you then start to arrive at an objective scored level of maturity for that particular dimension.
We haven't got time to run through each of those dimensions today, but we will look. Let's look at just a couple of them and see how we might do an assessment. What the goals might be, what the outcomes that you're trying to achieve might be, and what the proof points. Some of those proof points might be that you're going to measure against. This is the approach that we took with a health organisation late last year when they just wanted to assess the maturity of their communications, not the whole digital team, but the communications team in particular, who are responsible for primarily the external communications for that organisation. So we didn't run through every single dimension because they weren't applicable. They had no control over some of the ICT stuff, though, a little bit there. So we worked with the communication through the dimensions that were applicable. So today, let's just have a look at, in some depth, both the communications dimension and the knowledge and skills dimension, because they're going to apply, we think they'll apply to every organisation. But even if you're just looking at the maturity of a team, these will apply to each team as well. So looking at the communications dimension, we have 3 stages. We're saying that that first stage is really not a stage. It's you're not really aware of things at that initiate stage, but most people will have moved, at least in some of those dimensions, as I said earlier, into at least the launch stage, because that's when they're trying to say, okay, so we know we need to do this. We know we're early in the journey. We recognise that it's good for us. It's good for our customers. It's good for our clients. It's good for the public, depending on what sort of organisation you are at. And we want to see just where we are, how well we're starting to move, what we've got in place, and how we can then move further forward. So in the launch stage, we might have a goal which is a recognised need for accessibility of internal and external communications. We've got some plans that are starting to come together, or maybe in sort of an early stage that are in place to identify the communications where accessibility criteria should be integrated. And the organisations that we've worked with, they think about some of those communications, particularly the externals, they often forget about the internal communications. They often think about the website, but they forget about the fact that there may be a video on that website, or they forget about the fact that they may be running seminars that are public seminars that are going to be like this seminar, and the materials that are made available before and after also need to be accessible, and the communications inviting people to participate. So the outcomes that they might be looking for, we might be looking for at that stage, are that there are plans in place for making all their internal and external communications accessible, and that they're meeting the accessible regulations or standards that they've chosen. At the integrate stage, the goal is that the communications roadmap is in place, that we're integrating accessibility criteria into all of our, or most of our communications. That's actually happening. People are aware of the need to it, what those criteria are, what they need to do about it, and that non-accessible tools might be replaced, or the procurement of accessible tools is in process. So you've identified that if you're a higher education institution, I keep coming back to that because Neil and I have been embedded in that recently. The learning management system might not have all the accessibility features that you might need to serve the needs of staff. Learning management and or some of the requirements for students with disabilities to access it. We're looking for internal and external delivery of accessible communications across most media and platforms at this integrate stage, with an accessibility policy in place that includes the requirements for a feedback mechanism and a process for handling any complaints that may come in. Because at that integrate stage, we're looking to take on board anything that's going wrong as well, so that we can address it. When we move to the optimized stage, then we hopefully we have full accessibility processes for everything, all our communications. The tools are fully accessible, so we're in utopia, if you like. Hard to get to that stage across the board, but that's the goal of getting to that optimized stage, so that all the processes and procedures and tools are in place. They're used consistently. They're regularly reviewed and refined. We're talking to our vendors so that the accessibility is maintained. We're talking to our developers if they're internal products, so that all that communication is fully accessible. So what are some of the proof points that we might use to measure progress in the communications dimension? First of all, let's make sure that all our corporate document templates, Word, PowerPoint, etc., are accessible. Let's make sure that the templates that we're using for our web pages are accessible. The templates that we might be using, electronic document connections to our customers, our promotional emails and so on, are accessible. So what level of accessibility have we got in all those different corporate document templates? What about the processes and procedures for creating those communications? Are they documented, and are the accessibility features documented? Are the criteria that particular teams or particular individuals with different roles for designing, creating, authoring all that communication, is that documented? Is it understood? And is the infrastructure in place to ensure that accessibility is then delivered? What level of infrastructure is in place? So how far down that launch, integrate, optimize stages are we on the communications dimension? The websites, our email marketing, mentioned that. Social media, didn't mention that when we talked about document templates. So have we got accessibility built into our social media communications as well? Do they meet WCAG as the basis? But probably we want to say, are we actually going beyond the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for some of this communication? Is it actually usable? We've all probably heard about situations, where the website or the email is technically conforming with WCAG, but it's not actually usable by some groups of or some individuals with particular assistive technology, adaptive strategies, ways of looking at the materials that we're presenting. Does the website have an accessibility statement? what sort of a statement is it? Is it just a statement of intent, or does it go beyond that and say that you acknowledge some areas where you mightn't quite be up to scratch, and invite people to get in contact with your call center, for instance, to work around a particular issue that you're aware of that they might have. Is there a clear feedback mechanism for handling those questions and accessibility complaints? Because as we're moving towards integrate and beyond integrate to optimize, we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our staff in particular, but from a commercial perspective, our customers or our clients or the general public, if you happen to be a not-for-profit or a government agency. So they're just some of the proof points, and there's more listed in the W3C documentation, but they're typical of the proof points that we will be looking for to say just how are you. What level of maturity are you at? Have you moved beyond launch? Have you got to integrate on some? And as I said, the organisation that we looked at last year, they were at initiate on a couple of things, a couple of the dimensions. Some of them, a lot of them, they were at launch stage. And I can't remember which one, but there was one of the dimensions, one of those 7 dimensions, where they'd actually moved well into the integrate stage, and so we were then making recommendations about how they could lift across the board. Let's have a look at knowledge and skills dimension. I'll throw back to Neil.
Yeah, so again, we'll just go through some, just as Andrew did there, we'll go through some goals and outcomes for each stage, and then we'll talk a little bit about the proof points as well. And again, just worth emphasizing, these are just examples of goals and outcomes and proof points. There are a lot more in the model itself, but you could make your own up as well if you wanted to amend it as well and make it fit the requirements you have. But we don't have time to cover all of them, so we just thought we'd pick a few. So with the knowledge and skills dimension, the goals and outcomes would, if we start at the launch stage, accepting as given that the inactive stage, there are no goals, outcomes, or indeed proof points. It's like pre-Big Bang. So at the launch stage, we recognize that there's a need for organization-wide accessibility and disability inclusion, as well as accessibility expertise. So that recognition is there. Planning has been initiated, or it is about to be initiated. Activities, though, are not well organized, and we mentioned that earlier on as a sign of what the launch stage actually is. Skills areas are identified. This would be an outcome, and plans for organization-wide surveys to identify gaps would be initiated, but not necessarily at this point implemented. But they would certainly be considered as being necessary to be done, and planning would be underway for that. At this point, it's mostly ad hoc training that exists, if it exists at all. Professional development is not required or monitored typically. Great if it is, but usually at this stage it would not be. Some training courses have been established or will be, or there is a plan to establish them that's clearly laid out. And particularly that will be the case for onboarding new people or for annual refreshers. At the integrate stage, so we've moved on to the next stage of maturity, and you can tell because the workforce, the workforce and the ICT accessibility skills and training roadmap is now in place. So we talked about that at the previous level. Now at this level, you can't just talk about it; you've actually got to do it, and so that will be a goal to set for this particular stage if you're going to achieve this stage. Integration of the process to assess and increase accessibility knowledge and skills is in progress. And then if you look at the outcomes, how you go back and say, have we achieved this? And if we have, we can say that this dimension is now at the integrate stage. Role-based training is available for people, and the roles plus current information on new technologies, platforms, and tools is being made available. Training metrics are established. Again, you can't measure, if you don't measure it, you don't know what you're doing. So the metrics will help you to measure the training in future and the effectiveness in terms of accessibility. And at the optimized stage, which is the highest stage you can get to, the goal would be for an organization role-based expertise in accessibility and disability inclusion. It has to be well defined, it has to be evaluated and remediated where necessary, and continuously enhanced. And there needs to be a process in place to ensure that that happens, and a goal needs to be set to make that happen. Accessibility knowledge and skills are consistently implemented across the organization. So it's not ad hoc anymore. It's a consistent part of what the organization does. And to measure whether you've achieved that, you'd want some outcomes, and they might include that the workforce is periodically evaluated to ensure knowledge and skills are currently with the most up-to-date standards of accessibility practice. You might want to periodically analyze periodically do an analysis to identify any gaps in training materials and knowledge that's currently available. So again, if you need to know that you're actually making available the resources and the necessary modules that are going to be taken up by people, and that they are up to date and current. And that annual training is offered, as well as the opportunity for people to attend conferences, events, online activities, etc. They need to be provided to maintain skills. The workforce inclusion training should be ensure that it incorporates accessibility and inclusion, and that it includes people with disability. There needs to be tracking systems in place that can be consistently used to maintain training inventories and measure skills and track completion. So it's all very well setting up these systems, but then you have to make sure that people are actually taking advantage of them. Otherwise, it's not completed. And what sort of proof points, what sort of evidence could you use to measure the progress in this dimension? Well, again, these aren't exhaustive, but it's a short list. It would include things like assessing current skill levels to identify and address gaps. Those gaps might be in organizational surveys that identify current skill levels, and so that if you don't have those surveys, you don't know where the gaps might be. You might want to check that there are internal databases that do track employee training for ICT accessibility skills. Again, those systems may not be very well developed at the beginning, but by the time you've reached the optimized stage, they would need to be in place. You want to be keeping skills up to date with current requirements, so that needs to be checked at all times. Accessibility criteria is integrated into individual performance measures. So when people at the end of their year and they're discussing with their managers about how well they've done that year, one measure is very often the learning and development that they do. Well, accessibility training should be part of that. Building and maintaining organizational capacity is also really important. So the implementation of role-based training plans and curriculums. So you actually need that to be written down. It needs to be put into a plan. Again, those will be developed more strongly as you move through the maturity stages. Accessibility training is made available for onboarding of all new employees. Very likely it isn't in the early stages, or if it is, it's not necessarily made available to everybody, and it needs to be something which is considered a standard part of the onboarding process. Accessibility requirements included in position descriptions so that people know what is expected, but also what is provided. And there should be subject matter experts, SMEs, who are appointed within the organisation to provide training and support. They will be needed as the organisation becomes more sophisticated when it comes to its knowledge and skills requirements.
So as we said earlier, we'll often undertake a gap analysis to look at where a organisation or a team is at and where they would like to be at, and how they, what recommendations can be made, what processes and improvements can we put in place to move them up that scale of accessibility. So the four aspects rather that we'll commonly do to look at where the gaps are and where we can make recommendations to an organisation through interviews and talking to people, through documentation reviews, through process reviews, and through output reviews. What are they actually putting out there, and are there gaps in the accessibility of that?
So let's look at some of these particular aspects and processes, because at this point we're doing a gap analysis, but it is going to help us in that assessment of the maturity of an organisation. So interviews, who are we going to interview? Well, interviews, we call them interviews, but actually they're conversations, they're chats, they're a chance for us to find out about what people do and who they are, where they sit in the organisation, and what their level of understanding is around accessibility. And we will talk to product owners, designers, developers, content creators, testers, and quality assurance. And obviously a key aspect of group of people to talk to is leadership, because you need leadership buy-in if you're going to make that move up the maturity stages continuum. And a really key constituency is staff or customers, but particularly staff in many organizations that we work with, staff who themselves have a disability, because they will tell you themselves what their actual experience is, whether that aligns with what they should have experienced according to the leadership team is an interesting conversation. Other people we'll talk to would include marketing and communications. Obviously, they have a key role to play in the development of accessibility, and people and culture, and particularly those responsible for diversity and inclusion developments. And we might also talk with call center staff, because they do a lot of work, particularly with customer support. We'll be looking for different things from different teams and individuals. We won't ask them all the same questions, although there will be some overlaps. We want to understand across the organization what the commitment of that organization is, what the commitment of the leadership is, where internal support sits and whether there is any, and if there is, how is it provided and how well is it provided, what the client support mechanisms are, and then what recruitment processes are used, what communication methods, and what is happening at the coalface. So understanding of policies, the level of knowledge, roles and responsibility that people have, and also the tools that they might use to actually get the jobs done. So again, a lot of things are said and written down in policies and guidelines and processes, but how much of those are happening? How much of those are happening at the everyday level?
And some of the processes that we would be looking for, and we'll pick and choose out of these depending on the organisation, what they're trying to achieve, and whether it's the organisation or just the a team that's trying to lift their own maturity. Design and development, and that's how far. When do they take into account digital accessibility? So that's that stages that Neil was mentioning. Do they take it into account back at the conceptual stage, or is it sort of left until the development stage or the quality assurance stage? And we've all heard the stories of, it's got to go out tomorrow, but somebody's told us it's meant to be accessible. Can you have a quick look today before we launch tomorrow? So we're looking for those processes. Are they documented? But even if they're informal processes, what are those processes for that design and development? What are the publishing processes, and when does accessibility get caught? Is accessibility considered in procurement? And for many organisations, that's still a very early sort of thing. It might be being considered if you're procuring some design services or some development services, but often it's forgotten about when you're thinking about what the content management system is, or the learning management system, or the the EDM, the electronic dark marketing system that you're looking at. What about your events? Is there anything around events? And again, this will depend on the organisation. What about your marketing materials and preparation of those? What about your recruitment? And again, this is a gap. People are saying that we expect our people to know about this, but if it's not being put down as one of the recruitment checks, then it's probably going to get picked up. And then, what's the support? Does your call centre actually know that some people might be ringing up because they're using, say, a screen reader? And is there somebody in the call centre who that particular question about how do I do this, apply for this concession or whatever it might be, if they're using a screen reader? So how are you supporting? What's the process to support people with disability?
And then there's the document review, and the documentation review is a really important aspect of finding out where an organisation is either publicly or at least internally placed with respect to accessibility. And the kind of documentation that you're looking at is going to depend very, very largely on the organisation itself. What documentation does it have available? What are we looking for? First of all, we're looking for commitment around accessibility. Has anyone even talked about it in any documentation that has been produced? We're looking for measurement. So have they got a measuring system in place that allows them to determine their level of accessibility? Or is it just something that they kind of make up as they go along? We're looking for plans. Is there a strategic plan for implementing accessibility? May not happen all at once. It might happen over several years, but is there a plan for that? Looking for a process. What are the processes that are used in order to ensure accessibility is remembered and thought of at all stages of the development cycle? And if there are any processes. And what sort of documents would they be? Well, they might be policies and strategies. If they exist, that's a good sign. It's a showing of commitment and intent. Doesn't mean to say that they're being followed, but at least it means that they are there and that they exist. There might be annual reports which include disability action plans, or a statement or a report about the work that's been going on around accessibility or disability. We like to have a look at the risk register if it exists, and if they capture any accessibility related risks on that register. Any procurement documentation. If you're going to procure accessibly, you need to have the wherewithal to do that. You need to have policy in place. You need to be asking the right questions. You need to be making sure that the right information is included or the right text is included in RFIs, RFPs, contracts, etc. And the accessibility support materials that exist. If people need support, how are they going to get it? Where are they going to get it from? Do they know how to do that? Then there'll be job descriptions and professional developments plans. What are they? Do they exist? And then really interestingly, we can then loop back when we do the interviews to ask people if they even knew those documents existed.
Yeah, that's right. And often, you know, they say, well, I'm generally aware that we had some policy in place, but ask me to point you to it, and they can't do that. There's just sort of some general awareness that it's a requirement somewhere. What about some sample outputs? You know, this is also interesting to have a look at, some sample client or customer communications, a quick look at the website or an app. And you know, we'll often ask if they've had any audits conducted recently. You know, sometimes we've conducted them, sometimes they've had audits conducted by internally or by another party. And we're looking for critical and high impact failures. You know, are they making really, really serious mistakes? We're also looking to see if there's common failures, you know, across you know, the website or the app, because they can lead us to make some strong recommendations about, you know, maybe upskilling, about putting some checklists or processes in place and things like that. So how do we bring it all together?
Well, we'll do that by producing a report which looks at, which makes recommendations based on what we've learned. And we will tell them what they're doing well as well, and we'll include that in the recommendations, because we want them to know what's already working well and what they're doing well right now. We want them to keep doing it, because we don't want them to get distracted from that. But also, what's holding them back? What did we find that was holding them back? And what practices were causing friction and were preventing them from moving forward? And we'll address our recommendations to both of those things, so that they maximize the good and minimize the bad, if you like. But the recommendations will also include some strategic and tactical suggestions and recommendations as well. We'll have leadership messages. We'll recommend how leadership should take responsibility for accessibility, because if they don't, it doesn't happen, and you certainly won't progress up that stage continuum. We'll talk to them and make recommendation about the support groups and networks that can be created within an organization, because accessibility does not happen in a mature sense if it's just left to one or two people. So building networks is a really strong way, and we'll recommend ways that might be implemented in their particular organization. Implementing skills and uplifting the lessons that they've learned. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about setting up portals for accessibility support, because if people know where to go to find out more, they're more likely to go there. If it's not in a unified place, they'll not find it. And we'll probably make recommendations on recruitment processes and practices, as well as procurement and things like that. And we'll, once having made those recommendations, we'll suggest priorities. We'll help them to prioritize those recommendations. You know, which were the ones which they must get on board with now, which are the ones that will take a bit longer, kind of medium term, and which are more long-term requirements that will take a bit longer. We will recommend timelines where we can, but timelines are very organizational dependent. And so sometimes we'll make a suggestion about timelines, but we will strongly encourage them. In fact, one of our early recommendations will be that you need to build a timetable for addressing some of these things. But if we can do it, we'll do that as well. So it does depend on the organization, though.
And just with respect to some of those tactical suggestions that we might make, everybody's looking for some quick wins. What can they actually do today that might start lifting them up that maturity ladder? What's some of the other support? Often in reviewing documents, we'll see places in policy and strategy that we mightn't write things, but we might say, in Chapter 6 of this particular policy, we strongly recommend that you include digital accessibility in there, or in the procurement process that is documented. Those specific documents might be branding guidelines that we've reviewed. Are all the branding guidelines and the colour schemes that they're considering, meeting the accessibility requirements for colour contrast, or mixing and matching those. And we do see where some organisations do it really well, but there's areas where they could improve in other places. Now, what are some practical suggestions? What is the basis? That can be the basis for having an accessibility support portal that Neil suggested. Every organisation effectively uses, Office, for instance. So, what could they put in place to make sure that people are lifting the game with all their Word and PowerPoint communications, because that's an internal communications mechanism. And then, thinking about how they could raise awareness and celebrate disability and accessibility across the board. Again, something they could put into an accessibility support portal are the different days that might be celebrated, such as International Day for People with Disabilities, Global Accessibility Awareness Day, particular disability days or weeks that get celebrated, in Australia, in New Zealand, elsewhere around the world. So making some recommendations around those so that they've got opportunities to promote and discuss and identify, ways of doing better, is a strong recommendation that we'll often make.
So closing off, we will just say, remember, it isn't just the ICT team or department that we're addressing when it comes to assessing maturity. It's any point in the organisation that touches the experience of an employee or a customer.
And so just to reiterate, measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. As H. James Harrington said, if you can't measure something, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you can't control it. If you can't control it, you can't improve it. And that's why this maturity assessment is so important. I know we're nearly out of time. Apologies for talking so much. But any questions? Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for that, Andrew and Neil. Obviously, a lot to pack in to an hour, and plenty of things to think about when it comes to your accessibility maturity. We've just got 2 quick questions that I think we might have time for. So the first one says, great talk. I'd like to know who you think should be in charge of collecting the proof points outlined in the W3C maturity model. I'm a digital accessibility specialist in my organization and am doing a maturity evaluation. I know the proof elements exist, but it's a different story to make sure the teams are aware of these proof points. How do I find out if teams know about them?
Wow.
That's where the conversations come in.
Yeah.
There might be stuff documented, but are people aware of it? It really comes back to those conversations. It might be small focus groups, it might be chats with individuals, but you need to have a list of things that you want to follow through. To collect those, it's that awareness as much as anything that you're looking for. Often, the documentation might be there, but are people actually following through with it? Has it been promulgated? Are you getting messages from the senior management on any sort of regular or even irregular basis, confirming that it's that digital accessibility is a thing that the organisation holds up there as one of their goals?
And also, what are your priorities? Don't expect you're going to be able to do everything in one go. So, choose your priorities carefully, and also do whatever you can to get your boss's buy-in and your boss's boss's buy-in because they're the ones who will ultimately own this for you. But especially at the early stage, we always find this at the very, very early stages. Accessibility is a passion project, and it does rely on people who are particularly actively interested in accessibility to start with, but it has to be systematized into the organization for it to go in much further.
Great, thanks for that. And just very quickly, our last question, how might we gauge an organization's appetite to raise its maturity to the next stage, for example, to the integrate stage? And how might we encourage an organization to push for greater maturity?
I think that's very much goes back to how you gauge the appetite is what are they currently saying? And that is, do they have any kind of digital accessibility policy? Do they have an action plan for D&I and that kind of thing? Do they do anything like that to start with? Because if they don't, the appetite is probably in its early stages, shall we say. But don't be disillusioned either, because we've worked with a number of organizations who have got many, many, many documents and policies and guidelines, but actually are still at a very early stage because it's all over the place. On the other hand, we've worked with organizations who don't really have anything documented, but are doing some really, really good stuff in certain pockets, and they just need to be celebrated. And how you persuade others to take that on board is talk about it to other people, explain why accessibility is important, why your customers or your employees are going to lose out if you don't raise your game with respect to accessibility. We mentioned earlier that there are risks associated with lack of accessibility. We haven't talked about that particularly, but it is something to think about. But particularly, an organization wants to be seen to be doing the right thing. And we do know that the more accessible an organization is, the more likely it is to be highly thought of, to be profitable, and also to have a really good reputation.
And if you're outside an organisation, you can look at some of their documentation. Have a look at their annual. Go to the About Us area. See if they've got an annual report. Does inclusion, or more particularly disability and digital accessibility, if we drill down, get mentioned in their annual report? Have they published a diversity and inclusion policy or an action plan? That probably, in Australia at least, is meant to be lodged with the Australian Human Rights Commission. You can do a lot of digging around, what an organisation's appetite might be just by what they're saying publicly. Bring up their, the helpline, or send an email if there's a contact point, and ask a few pointed questions even, if you're outside that organisation, to help gauge what their appetite might be like.
Awesome. And on that note, we will leave it there. Andrew, Neil, I think we could have this conversation for about another 5 or 6 hours, knowing us, but no, this has been so useful. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your insights and your knowledge. It's really appreciated. A big thank you to everyone who's come along to this webinar. If you do want to catch anything that was said throughout the webinar, because there was a lot of information, a lot of guidance provided in there, you can catch the recording of this on our YouTube channel, which we'll post up shortly, and we'll share links to that on our social media when it's ready. We do also want to give a big thanks again to our captioners, AI Media, and a thank you to all of you for coming along. It's been really appreciated, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.